Well, hello everybody. Pastor Randy here. Welcome to Making It Simple. Hope you're doing great on this beautiful Friday. We're at the end of another week and almost at the end of another year. What a year. I saw someone had written, you see all these questions on Facebook and different places. And someone wrote yesterday, if you could describe this year in one word, what would it be? I thought about that actually quite a bit. And I think you could find all kinds of different words. Hard, challenging. You could go on and on. But at the end of the day, if you've made it, if you've survived it through the goods, the bads, and the uglies, that one word should actually be blessed. We continue today looking at infancy. I think we'll probably wrap this up today, depending on how we get through this discussion. But I stopped yesterday talking about getting caught up in the argument instead of the action. I gave a few illustrations yesterday of foolish things that again are embarrassing on one side. On the other side, it's reality. It happens when immaturity begins to override what needs to be there. When we forget who we are in Christ, when we forget who we represent. In the world today, we have a plethora, and that's my big word for the day. I don't use that a lot, but we have an unimaginable number of agendas and causes. Everybody's got a community. Everybody's got a group. Everybody's got an argument. Well, we say, well, Pastor, that's the world. That's not true. And again, I don't say these things to be denigrating or ugly or judgmental. But friends, this is where we get back to the understanding of Scripture. This is where we get back to understanding the message that Jesus gives the church, not the world, the church in the letters found in Revelation. It begins at the church of Ephesus. It ends at the church of the Laodicea. And how do those things combine? You get to the first one, it says, you have left your first love. I have this against you. You end at the Laodicean saying, well, you say that you have need of nothing, yet still you can't see that you are naked and wretched and blind and poor. Do we see how those two things come together? If you leave or ignore or walk away from your foundation, from what you are built on, from what is most important, it will crumble. We've allowed the ways of the world, the model of the world, to not only integrate itself into the church, but in many ways to consume why we're even there. And again, the church not being a facility. We tend to use that word as it pertains to a particular structure with a steeple and a cross. But the church that Jesus called is his body, me and you, the believer. But we've intentionally or not intentionally left our first love. And we've replaced it with a name, or we've replaced it with a cause, or we've replaced it with an agenda, or we've replaced it with a argument over what style of worship, what version of the Bible, this, and we all these different things. So the church is not exempt. How does this play into spiritual infancy? Because it becomes so immature, the arguments and the divisionary things that take place, it is a complete and utter distraction for why we gather to start with. The Baptists want to be right. The Lutherans want to be right. The Episcopals want to be right. The Methodists want to be right. The Presbyterians want to be right. The Catholics want to be right. And I could go on and on and on. And after a while, what happens is, in the course of that, the argument about making my case, the argument about, well, we do it better, the argument about, well, our way is right, the embracing of that allows the divide between the body to grow deeper. And oftentimes what we find in that is it also increases the immaturity. We expect foolish arguments from children because they're immature. We expect silly things to come from those that aren't developed to the place that they're supposed to be. We expect that. We expect babies to cry. We expect toddlers to throw fits, whatever. Children oftentimes, seemingly from a parental thing, argue over the silliest things. I'll use my girls, they're not in the room with me, I'll use them as an example. As they were growing up, my youngest children are identical twins. Many people still to this day really can't tell them apart, especially if they don't know them. Obviously, we lived with them for 13 years, so we know who's who, and there are some differences if you're around them long enough. But regardless, as they were growing up, when they were little, much younger, obviously they're still little in my eyes, but they would have the silliest arguments and the typical arguments, if you will. Of course, we're riding somewhere, she looked at me, she touched me, she chews too loud. I mean, just, all the silly things. And you just kind of, okay, cut it out, and you go on about your way. But there was one day, as we're driving down the road, that will stick out in my mind probably as long as I live, or at least as long as I have a memory. It was just too funny not to react, because while children's arguments oftentimes are silly and nonsensical, this one was actually really funny because it was so silly that you had to stop and listen to it. Again, let me restate, they are identical twins. So one is arguing at the other, and they say, Dad, she looks like me. I almost had to stop the car from laughter. And I said, well, I can't fix that one. I can tell them don't look at each other and don't touch each other, but I can't stop you from looking like each other. God did that one. Okay, so we laughed. We had our comical moment there. We laugh at that. But my point in telling you that is, okay, that's silly. However, we expect that. That's children. That's what they do. But let's move the needle to the adult, to the spiritually immature that may be 30, maybe 70, that wants to make the argument, that wants to stand firm on the cause, on the this or on the that, never once stopping to realize that what they're doing, how they're acting, what they're saying, has no benefit to the cause of Christ at all. Zero. A complete and utter foolish waste of time. It doesn't represent Christ. So the question is, in the midst of this, do we stop and realize that? Do we take an assessment, an evaluation, if you will, an inventory of what are we not only taking part in, but what are we allowing to consume our thoughts, which ultimately direct our actions? Do we focus on the silly and the unimportant and the immature? Or rather, do we embrace the one thing that should unify all of us, and that is that God loves us. And he loves us so much that he sent Jesus to die in our place. And on the third day he arose, and he welcomes all who will come to him and believe. Friends, that's the message. That's the gospel, that God, his desire is that none should perish. His desire is that we would be one. His desire is that we would come together. And yet still we allow every and anything to get in the way of that. Silly stuff, and I can't stress it any other way. Silly stuff gets in the way. This holds true in life in every aspect, whether it's physical and natural or whether it's spiritual. And it has a grander effect the more we allow it. In other words, when my wife will tell you this, there are certain commercials on television that absolutely just annoy me to the nth degree. Whether it's a stupid song or whether it's a just something that I know that is just a blatant lie and it's just not true, but yet still they continue to purvey this in front of people. So these commercials consume every channel. You can't get away from it, whether it's cable TV, regular TV, whatever. About the only way you can get away from it is streaming. And we don't always have time just to sit and watch movie after movie. We have things to do. So rather than allow that to steal the enjoyment that I'm having for the television show, I have learned to become the master of the quick draw of the mute button. I'll listen to it. I don't allow it to steal my joy. The same can hold true for all the different things that we allow to take parts away from us that we shouldn't allow. These silly, foolish arguments, if we allow them to come in to our worship, if we allow them to come into our holy place, if you will, our communion with the Lord and with one another, and we allow that division to take place, the enemy is in the midst of that, for he is the author of chaos, not God. And so we need to understand that we need to also become masters of the mute button, the off button, the rebuke, but whatever. We need to not allow it there. In the process of all of these things, if we've looked at this spiritual immaturity, this infancy, if you will, of being a giver, of being a receiver and not a giver, standing in the way of this and pitching a fit over that and allowing these things to consume our very thought. We go back to our passage from 1 Corinthians, and Paul is saying, what are you doing? You should be past this. But since you're not, then I'm going to talk to you. If you want to act like a baby, I'm going to talk to you like one. And so in essence, what he's saying is, okay, you won't listen to it any other way. You want to act childish and foolish, so I'll speak to you in such manner. And he comes back around ultimately to say, again, what are you doing? You've been given not only a truth, you have been given the truth, a large difference in those one little word that has changed things. And he's saying you've become consumed by the argument. You've become consumed by this or that, and now you've allowed it to redirect your worship in that, who are you following? You're not following Jesus anymore, not in acting like this. You've turned your attention toward me or Apollos or whoever else. In other words, you've began to look to people instead of the Father. Another great sign of immaturity. Now, should we have respect for others? Absolutely. No question about that. Some people earn a high level of respect because of their position, because of their character, whatever the case. Not everybody with a big title earns that, because sometimes they just don't, because they're a horrible person or whatever the case. But oftentimes, And especially, I grew up in that era, and most my age would recognize this. You still said yes, ma'am, and no, sir, whatever the case. You were respectful to those, especially those older than you. Absolutely. But you were mostly respectful to others in some form or fashion. So this is not about not having respect for others. We should show honor to others. Part of the Ten Commandments is honor your father and mother. That does not say love. That says honor them. So, because sometimes some parents are very difficult to love in the sense of an emotional bond, but God didn't say that. He said honor them. We honor others. We appreciate others. That's a given. That's a fact. But should we ever worship another beyond the Lord Himself? Absolutely not. Not only is it in the Ten Commandments, you shall have no other God before me. I am a jealous God, whatever, all those things. There is not another human being alive that should be worshiped. None. Zero. I don't care who they are or what position they hold, whether they're a pastor, whether they're a president, a mayor, a singer, an athlete, it doesn't matter. And we've seen that come to be, especially in the modern era, that seemingly many people don't just have a fandom toward another person. Again, regardless of their position or whatever title they hold, but it's almost become cultic. It's almost become a worship. I have sat and physically seen this to where it was not an adoration. It was not a appreciation. It was flat out worship. That's not good. That's immature. And Paul is saying here, when one of you is saying, and actually what he's stating there is when one of you are trying to argue your case, which is what we were talking about, that I'm on Paul's side, or the other one says, I'm on Apollos' side, he says, aren't you being totally infantile? In other words, listen to what you're doing. Listen to the argument you're trying to make. Because he turns that back around and he's really talking about himself. He says, who do you think I am? Who do you think Apollos is? We're just servants, just like you. We've just been blessed to hear the message from God and to be able to give it back to you. But we're not worthy of being worshipped, nor should we be. Don't put, and I've told people this countless times over the years in ministry, don't put me on a pedestal. Don't do that. I get up in the morning and I put my socks on just like anybody else. I'm honored to do what I do. I'm honored to have the title of pastor. I struggle with that sometimes because I know I'm not worthy. God gave me this gift and made it clear to me that I'm supposed to share in these teachings. But what Paul is trying to get them to understand here is we're in this together. And if we're going to, as he would later say, finish the race, if we're going to do that, we have to do it together. Because if we're all divided, if we're all bickering over this or that, or pointing fingers, and you did this, and you looked at me, and all the silly things that get in the way, we're not going to make it. Because we're not keeping our eyes on the prize before us. Remember, the finish line is always ahead of us every single time. Paul is saying here, we're blessed to be able to serve, to lead, to teach, but we're not worthy of worship. And anybody should understand that. But when we're spiritually immature, when we're still in infancy and refuse to see beyond, then we're incapable of being able to grow to be the person that God calls us to be. Only God sits on the throne. The current political climate that we have, and I want to be very careful here, but because I don't ever want to make my messages about that. It has become worship for a lot of people, and that's very unhealthy. Because I assure you, just as I'm sitting in this chair with a bald head and a blue shirt, if you're worshiping someone else besides Jesus Christ, if you're placing your faith and your hope and your dreams in the hands of another person, I don't care who they are, whether someone you personally know or some celebrity or some politician or some athlete, you will be disappointed. And that's just a fact. Only God sits on the throne. And there's no extra room. Idol worship is still very alive today, and it's not necessarily trinkets and gadgets on a shelf, or wooden statues, or golden calves, or anything else. It's on the form of, or in the form, I should say, of characters. And many people are just playing characters. It's not real. But people have begun to worship the facade of what's been placed in front of them. And Paul is saying to the believer, and I believe not just then, but to every believer now, there's only one that deserves this honor. Babies need mom. Babies need dad and grandparents and all those that love them and that will help them grow and mature and increase in knowledge and move forward in life. But the spiritual infant also has quite a few needs. And I think at our time today, we're going to stop right here and we'll talk about what those needs are on Monday and wrap this lesson up and then move into the next part. Obviously, next week will be closer to Christmas. I want to talk about that a little bit and what that means, but I want to continue in this pattern because it all ties together. Immaturity, it hinders our life if we refuse to grow. Growth is very important in all parts of life, but most certainly in our spiritual life. And God gives us the tools. He gives us the ability. And Paul in this passage is making that clear. Be very, very careful where you place your worship. God bless you. I look forward to seeing you on Monday. Have a great weekend. I'll talk to you soon.